Our first tour guide is Professor Simon Bronitt, who is the Director of the ARC Centre for Excellence in Policing and Security based at Griffith University, and he's going to give us a tour focused on the policing and security area.
Thank you, and welcome to the tour. Thank you first to Gabrielle for organising this fantastic event, and yesterday I can attest to the value of the technology, because I used the online capabilities to virtually participate. I was very keen to experience the conference virtually, and I can honestly vouch the technology will change the way we engage as academics, and I was asking a question from Kingston, not not Jamaica, but rather here in Canberra. But it is a wonderful wonderful technology, and I think it will change the way we will do business in the future. First, a few words about CEPS. It's founded 2007. It's an ARC Centre of Excellence. It's a consortium of 4 universities. We have a number of policing partners. And I'd just like to reiterate Aidan Byrne's statements, the director of the chief executive of the Australian Research Council, who funds a significant slab of research in Australia, and including the Centre of Excellence programs. He emphasised, and of course as a director of one of these centres, because I believe it, the importance of these centres, which constitute about 25% of the available research funding in Australia. And they're important because, as he said, that they bring together in a real-world way and in a physical space people from a range of disciplines. Sometimes there isn't dialogue, sometimes there are simultaneous monologues, but generally the aspiration of these centres is to pursue essentially the agenda of integration with industry partners and government partners, but also engage across disciplines to tackle the difficult issues. And trained as a lawyer, as I am, I had my field of vision very severely narrowed through my education, and my own journey with interdisciplinarity really began at this university in the early 90s, and with work with Gabrielle on the heroin trial, as I said before. The interesting thing about the integration implementation enterprise is how you have to deal with essentially 2 cultures. They are the cultures of the academy, which sets its own sets of drivers and indicators of excellence, and they tend to be, until relatively recently, very much geared around publication and grant success, and peer esteem, all of which feed into each other. Outreach, as we used to call it, the extent to which you try to make your work have a real-world impact, was something, if you did it, that's terrific, well done. You weren't going to get promoted on the basis of that, however significant your practice impact might be. So academics really have a struggle here in the balance between those 2 activities. On the other hand, practitioners similarly are not rewarded necessarily for engagement with researchers. In fact, some will be signalled quite clearly not to engage with the research community, and getting a PhD qualification in some industry sectors and government sectors will not be viewed with anything other than an exit strategy into the academy. Because you are making that transition from a real-world practitioner to an ivory tower academic. So it's not surprising, as I do this tour, and I'm going to look at really picking out some of the posters that reflect on these points. You'll see that there's a constant theme about the challenges of effective collaboration with industry, In a number of them, you'll see the importance of what we've called practitioner fellows. I actually think this is key. And in fact, the APS 200 project recognises it is vital, if we're going to take the idea of evidence-based policy and practice further, policymakers, industry practitioners have to be resourced to spend time in the research community and vice versa. But I think we only have a few examples of really significant long-term practitioner fellowships, and so we'll profile some of them on this tour. And I think the other thing is learning, as we do, from cases. Some of these poster presentations will talk about the examples of the struggles of bringing about a true interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, sometimes overcoming the silos. You can have the rhetoric around interdisciplinarity, but what in fact you have are the psychologists doing their thing, the lawyers doing their thing, and occasionally at the end of the project they might come and have a simultaneous monologue together. To the bemusement of the industry practitioners. So the rhetoric and the reality doesn't always match. So my poster is actually a reprise of a paper I delivered to the 28 centres directors, people like me at the ARC, and it actually forms the basis of a chapter in the book that we'll be launching, so I'll very briefly outline it. What we want is a virtuous cycle of collaboration, that we engage with industry, with policy at an early stage, that we produce relevant research that has impact, and there's a feedback that continues, that relationship continues to generate and stimulate further research. And that's the rhetoric, and that's what we strive to do. The reality is sometimes a vicious cycle, which is the dialogue of the deaf. And this is actually, I should give acknowledgement to David Bradley, who in fact took it from someone else in the UK, MacDonald, a policing scholar, who imagined this conversation. And if you look at the book, you'll see the academic posing the question, why do police ignore research? And the practitioner saying, why don't researchers produce usable knowledge? I mean, these kind of themes have been going throughout the conference over the last 3 days. Why do the police always reject any study that is critical of what they do? And, of course, the police practitioner saying, why do researchers always seek to show police in a bad light? Why don't police officers, says the academic, even read research papers, even when we produce them in truncated forms and spell it out in dot points? And the police practitioner saying, why can't researchers write in plain English? So you have this, and it goes on, and it's this imaginary conversation. Well, I think that was 1987. If we fast forward, I think we're not having a dialogue of the deaf. Truly, we're probably having a dialogue of the hard of hearing. And I think, so we've got some way to go. One of the key things, and this is a segue into it, is, well, how do we overcome this? And this is Inspector Jason Saunders, a practitioner fellow. Now, under our project, we've had successful practitioner placements and unsuccessful ones. And you can draw the inference because Jason, who has moved out of our centre, he was with us for over 2 years, full-time embedded in our centre, as he calls it, the embedded cop. He played a very significant role, and he'll tell you about it. If you go to our poster presentation, he's interviewed, and he'll tell you about his experience. Quite a risky strategy as a police officer, leaving the police environment and joining a research centre. So there's no doubt that he took a risk. He's actually the fourth practitioner that we've had, but he's the one, in a sense, that's been the most successful. And he reflects on what were the, if you like, the indicia of success. Because you can end up actually reinforcing all the prejudices. And we've had practitioner fellowships that have done all of that. And there's been little enlightenment, in fact, possibly even in some contexts, stakeholder damage, because it's important to get the right people in those roles. And the champion, the role of the champion here is really important. So the idea not only to champion the organisation, the policing organisation within the research community, but vice versa, to work within the organisation to assist translation of research into policy practice. And so you need people with high integrity within the policing agency and seniority to do that. As I say, personalities are important. Dialogue between the research practice communities right at the outset. We tend to historically particularly focus on police research by viewing the police as an object of study, to see them as something that we study them, they have to answer questions, we observe them, and then we leave them alone. And we don't even necessarily reveal to them what our real objectives are behind the research. In fact, we may, quite unethically, I would say, give them a false set of expectations about what research can achieve, partly because to get money to do research, you have to claim that you're going to produce all this national benefit. So, you know, one of the things are that I feel that a lot of practitioners feel very let down when they look at what they get back for all of their support. So having that engagement right at the outset, before you form the project, about what the pressing questions are, and even if they're not aware of them, you could alert them to the fact that, you know, they may not be conscious that this is yet a problem, but you can make the case because of, in other jurisdictions, this is a problem and it's coming your way now. So I think having that relationship, having that resource of a practitioner, not expecting the research practitioner to become an academic, if you like. That was the version 1 of the practitioner fellow, took some very well qualified senior police and used them, in my view, as senior research assistants. That's not what we seek to do. This is a large-scale example. Louise Porter, my colleague, we've really tried to apply that methodology in a large multidisciplinary research project with significant industry engagement, and I think we are on the way to developing a project that I know will go for a decade and will generate really useful, practical tools for policing to improve their training and outcomes in use of force, and that's so desperately needed, and is an antidote to the tendency for the quick fix, which of course in government and in industry, everyone wants everything now. But we've done a good job to educate them that there's a job to be done. Finally, to give a plug for something that's not a SEPS research at all, Rens paper, Rens Willems from the University for Peace in The Hague. It's a really interesting PowerPoint. It actually, amazingly, independently coming to the same conclusions. We use language, there's a whole proliferation of terms to describe the same thing. I think we can be in agreement about that there's a terminological smorgasbord to describe the same things, and I think that would be helpful if we might come to some consensus about how to describe this kind of research. But similarly rejects the two cultures thesis that there is this academic practitioner. I think it's really important. The practitioners are not objects of study, they're co-producers of knowledge. There are risks, and we've talked about this in the conference more generally, the risks of bias, challenges to validity. He refers to a paper by Fox in sociology, who, in a very cute way, turns this risk of bias into a virtue, as academics can turn things on their head, saying bias is an advantage. The fact you're working so closely with the end users of research, the practitioners, because it ensures relevance, practitioner relevance. But I think that does actually underplay the risks here. And of course, working in a very dangerous area, post-conflict settings, there are dangers to local participants in your research that you have to be aware of. And there's been, risks of obviously being drawn into local political conflict. And put the code there, it's important to learn some diplomacy skills. So a very good paper there. And look, I think that pretty much is where I'd like to leave it. If you're keen to learn more about SEPS and find out what we are trying to do, there's my contacts and website. So thank you. Oh, questions.
We have time for some questions.
Questions. There's one here. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation, Simon. I've just got, sorry, I should say my name, sorry. Ruth Carris from the Research School of Population Health at ANU. My question relates to, I suppose there's a bit of a conflict in terms of, sorry, I'll start again. Look, I agree with your premise that it's really important to involve practitioners in the design of research questions, but I sometimes think we get caught in the challenge with the need to generate and maintain goodwill with our would-be participants, partners, versus the uncertainty of whether we'll be successful in funding and the time that it needs to generate the partnership and then the time that we get knocked back. And I'm just wondering, how do you manage that conflict?
Well, we've struggled with this, and if you like, in SEPS 1, we decided in 2005, 2006 what the most important questions in policing and security research were for the next 5 years, and we built no flexibility into that. And immediately, although the industry had been engaged partly in the formation of those questions, but probably not enough, what became very apparent was that we were straitjacketed because of the way in which the research won't fund, in a sense, a flexible set of potential projects we don't know. And I think, Gabrielle, you've made this thesis in the book as well. We have to accept that if we're going to develop this new model of research, we have to, in a sense, create structures, and I think centres of excellence do that. And SEPS 2 is built in a very big slab of, if you like, strategic resource. I've tried to keep as much as possible away from individual projects so that we will have that adaptive capability to respond to problems and challenges that are not yet known, and so that we can be responsive to industry and government. Universities don't do that very well, the way in which we fund research at the moment. It's a good question.
David McDonald from the Australian National University. Simon, in the past and now, there are significant problems in the relationships between police and Indigenous people, I'm just wondering what insights you may have from your experiences with things like the embedded COP and collaborations and partnerships for how non-Indigenous researchers and academics may genuinely and respectfully and productively engage with Indigenous people in research endeavours.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, to the extent that academics, of course, are interested in those issues. Some of the work that we do and Indigenous areas are often a point of contention, but not exclusively. I mean, there are areas where, you know, there's a strong positive desire to do things differently and better, and so it's partly it's seeking out those agents and champions of change within the organisation, and they're often at the senior level. It's harder, obviously, as you get further down to the front line. You do encounter prejudice, but I think the great thing is that we obviously resource PhD students working in that field in Indigenous policing, Indigenous women in policing, and we've, you know, obviously built those relationships through the practitioner fellow that will open the doors that typically are closed to academic researchers. So we're doing a lot more now in that space than was hitherto done. And I'll just give one example. Sometimes there can be great win-wins. Queensland has the last Indigenous tracker, and this is a story of Indigenous policing that isn't well known. So these are actually police officers, Indigenous, using Indigenous skills, bushcraft, to assist in investigation, and they've pretty much died out. There were 2 surviving ones in far, far north Queensland, and we actually sent some leading scholars and our police practitioner on a journey, and it was a four-wheel drive journey for several days, to do some interviewing, some research on them, to talk about their experiences. And I'm delighted we were able to catch that, because they were in their 70s, but they were still being used, particularly when German tourists would go out to have a walk in the bush and get lost. But it was, to us, a very important oral history to capture. And it came out of that relationship. I read that there were a couple of trackers left and they were about to retire, and I thought someone should go and interview them. So we supported them with that research project, and a very important, I think, national resource for future researchers. Thank you, David.
Okay, if there are no more questions, thank you, Simon.
That's right. Okay.